The millennial paradox: raised to win, trained to lose. What's quietly unsettling? An entire generation was raised to believe they were exceptional, worked exactly as hard as they were told to, and still ended up unable to afford the life that once came standard. That isn't laziness. That isn't entitlement. That's a large-scale psychological rupture. I'm talking about millennials, people born roughly between 1981 and 1996. And before the jokes start, before the avocado toast I roll, stay with me. Because what happened to this generation isn't just economic, it's psychological. And it explains far more than people realize. Millennials became the first generation in modern American history expected to be worse off financially than their parents. The Pew Research Center confirmed this in 2020. That single data point matters more than it sounds like it should. Because when a generation grows up expecting progress and instead experiences regression, the brain doesn't simply adapt, it fractures. What you get is a strange internal conflict, high achievement mixed with chronic inadequacy, confidence taught early, colliding with failure experienced repeatedly. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the mental stress that happens when deeply held beliefs collide with lived reality. And millennials didn't experience it once. They've been submerged in it for decades. Imagine spending your entire childhood hearing, "You can be anything. You can win anything. Effort always pays off." Then graduating straight into a global recession where the participation trophy quietly transforms into a master's degree that costs more than a house used to. That gap between promise and outcome, that's where anxiety is born. And it goes deeper. Psychologist Gene Twenge, who literally wrote the book Generation Me, found that millennials score higher on narcissism scales than previous generations. But here's the part most people skip. They also score higher on anxiety, depression, and self-doubt. So you end up with a generation that simultaneously feels special and worthless. That isn't arrogance. That's a trauma response. With a LinkedIn profile, millennials were the testing ground for nearly every parenting experiment that came out of the self-esteem movement of the 1980s and 1990s. Helicopter parenting, constant praise. Everyone gets a trophy. You're amazing just for existing. These weren't bad intentions. They were well-meaning attempts to raise confident children using the best psychological theories available at the time. But confidence without proportional control over outcomes creates fragility. Then came the timing. Millennials entered adulthood right as the economy collapsed in 2008. They graduated into a job market that had fundamentally changed without anyone updating the instructions. The rules they were given no longer applied. That kind of whiplash doesn't just disappoint people, it rewires them. And then there's social media. Millennials didn't grow up with social media as children. That was Gen Z. Millennials encountered it as teenagers and young adults, right when identity is still forming. Facebook launched in 2004. Instagram followed in 2010, which means millennials learn how to be adults while simultaneously learning how to perform. Adulthood. Psychologist Tim Kasser's research on materialism and well-being shows that when people base self-worth on external validation, likes, status, comparison, mental health declines. Social media trains you to turn your life into a campaign, and the polls never close. You are always behind someone else. Now stack that on top of delayed adulthood. Millennials are postponing, or entirely skipping, traditional milestones like marriage, home ownership, and having children. Not because they don't want them. Surveys consistently show they do. But wanting something and being able to afford it are two different psychological realities. So you get people in their 30s and 40s who still feel like they were getting started. Except the waiting room is a $200 studio apartment, and the therapist is booked 3 months out. This prolonged uncertainty creates something psychologists call allostatic load, the stress your body carries when it is constantly preparing for a future event that never arrives. It's like being stuck in the loading screen of your own life, watching the progress bar refuse to move. And then there's the broken promise. Millennials were sold a very clear social contract: study hard, go to college, get a good job, work your way up. That system worked for decades. Then the landscape shifted. College costs exploded. Entry-level jobs demanded 5 years of experience, and stable employment was replaced by gig work, contracts, and flexibility without security. Psychologists call the collapse of a foundational worldview schema disruption. When it happens at scale, it doesn't just produce disappointment, it produces cynicism, distrust, and disengagement from institutions entirely. That's why millennials often appear both idealistic and deeply cynical. They still believe things should be fair. They just no longer believe they will be. That's not bitterness. That's pattern recognition. And about job loyalty, millennials get roasted for job hopping. But here's what rarely gets said. Corporate loyalty disappeared first. Pensions vanished. Layoffs became routine. Careers turned into transactions. Millennials didn't create this environment. They adapted to it. And adaptability, psychologically speaking, is not a flaw. Millennials are also one of the most educated and most diverse generations in history. They grew up with the internet, not just as entertainment, but as an information ecosystem. That creates a mind that questions narratives, authority, and systems. People who question broken systems often get labeled as entitled or difficult. But critical thinking will always look like rebellion in systems that depend on compliance. Millennials also changed the mental health conversation. They're the first generation to openly discuss anxiety, depression, and therapy, not as weaknesses, but as realities. That matters. But they're doing it while carrying historically unprecedented levels of student debt, unstable employment, inflated housing costs, and constant performance pressure. So yes, they're more self-aware. And yes, they're more overwhelmed. Finally, there's the future. Millennials are the generation watching the planet deteriorate in real time while being told they're responsible for fixing it, despite having less institutional power and fewer resources than the generations before them. Climate anxiety is now a documented psychological phenomenon, and millennials are standing directly in its blast radius. So when society asks, why are millennials so anxious, or why can't they just buy a house? The answer isn't mysterious. They were given a map that no longer matches the terrain, and their psychology reflects exactly what happens when humans are forced to navigate a world that changed without warning. If this hit uncomfortably close to home, subscribe. And if you want to support deeper, honest dives like this, hit the join button to become a channel member. I genuinely appreciate it.